Sarah walked into the small coffee shop on Main Street, her hand shaking slightly as she pushed open the glass door. The familiar chime overhead announced her arrival, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation she'd had with Dr. Martinez just hours before. The therapist had encouraged her to reach out to old friends, to try rebuilding the connections she'd lost over the past 2 years. David was already sitting at their usual corner table, the one they'd claimed during their college days when they would spend hours discussing everything, from philosophy to their dreams for the future. He looked up from his laptop and smiled, but Sarah caught the hint of concern in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. Everyone thought the same thing when they looked at her these days. "Sarah, you look good," David said, standing to give her a hug. She accepted it stiffly, her body tensing at the physical contact. "I ordered your usual black coffee, no sugar." "Thanks," she replied, sliding into the chair across from him. The leather squeaked under her weight, and she winced at the sound. Everything seemed louder these days, more intense. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, despite the warm spring weather outside. David studied her face for a moment before settling back into his chair. "So how have you been?" "Really, I mean, not the polite answer you give everyone else." Sarah hesitated. She'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come up. How could she explain what the last 2 years had been like? How could she make him understand the nightmares, the panic attacks, the way she jumped at every unexpected sound? How could she tell him about the medical leave from her teaching job, the sleepless nights, the way she'd isolated herself from everyone who cared about her? "It's been difficult," she said finally, staring down at her hands. "The deployment? It changed things." David nodded, but she could see the skepticism in his expression. He'd been one of the few people who'd questioned her decision to join the military reserves as a medic. A small-town girl from Ohio teaching elementary school. It didn't fit the image of a soldier in most people's minds, including his. "I know you had a tough time over there," he said carefully, "but you've been back for 2 years now. Maybe it's time to move forward." "I mean, you were stationed at a medical facility, right? It's not like you were in direct combat or anything." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard variations of this same sentiment from family members, friends, even some medical professionals. Because she'd been assigned to a field hospital rather than a combat unit, people assumed her experience had been somehow less traumatic, less real. "David, you don't understand what it was like," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The things I saw, the people I couldn't save." "I'm sure it was hard," he interrupted, his tone taking on that patronizing quality she'd become all too familiar with. "But you have to put it in perspective. You were there to help people, to save lives. That's something to be proud of, not something to hide from." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him about the mortar attacks, about the nights spent huddled in bunkers while explosions shook the ground around them. She wanted to explain how the field hospital had been targeted repeatedly, how she'd treated wounded soldiers while incoming fire made the walls tremble. She wanted him to understand that being a medic in a war zone meant being in the middle of the fighting, not safely removed from it. But she'd tried to explain these things before, to other people. They'd listened politely, nodded in all the right places, but she could see in their eyes that they didn't really believe her. How could someone like Sarah, quiet, gentle Sarah who used to cry when she accidentally stepped on ants, have survived something so brutal? "You're right," she said instead, forcing a smile. "I should be grateful for the experience." David's expression softened, and he reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "I didn't mean to minimize what you went through. I just think you might be dwelling on it too much. Maybe you need to focus on the positive aspects of your service." Sarah pulled her hand away, pretending to reach for her coffee cup. His touch, meant to be comforting, felt like sandpaper against her skin. "What positive aspects?" "Well, think about all the lives you saved. The difference you made, the fact that you came home safe and sound." He gestured toward her as if to emphasize his point. "You're sitting here with me right now, healthy and whole. That's something to celebrate. Healthy and whole. If only he knew. If only any of them knew what lay beneath the long sleeves she wore even in summer. The careful way she positioned herself so that her back was always to a wall. The prescription bottles hidden in her medicine cabinet. But these weren't things people could see. Weren't things that fit their comfortable narrative of the war. "You make it sound so simple," Sarah said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Maybe it is simple," David replied, leaning forward earnestly. Maybe you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. I mean, I know you went through some difficult things, but trauma affects everyone differently. Some people are just more resilient than others. The implication was clear even if he hadn't said it directly. He thought she was weak, that she was using her deployment as an excuse for her current struggles. He thought she was exaggerating, playing up her experiences for sympathy or attention. Sarah stared at him across the table, this man who had once been one of her closest friends. He meant well, she knew that, but his words cut deeper than any physical wound she'd sustained overseas. The worst part was that a small voice in her head wondered if he might be right. Maybe she was weak. Maybe she was making too big a deal out of what had happened. The coffee shop around them buzzed with normal life. Students typing on laptops, mothers chatting while their children played, elderly couples sharing newspapers, all these people living their lives. Unaware of the gulf that separated Sarah's experience from theirs, she envied them their innocence, their ability to believe that the world was a fundamentally safe place. I should probably go, Sarah said, starting to gather her things. Already? We just got here. David looked disappointed but not surprised. This is what I'm talking about, Sarah. You can't keep running away from normal life forever. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah sat in the circle of folding chairs, listening to Tom share his story about surviving an IED explosion in Afghanistan. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as he described the moment his convoy was attacked and how he'd lost his hearing in his left ear. The other veterans in the support group nodded with understanding, their faces reflecting shared experiences that outsiders couldn't comprehend. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself hesitating. Even here, among people who should understand, she felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing down on her chest. I was stationed at a field hospital, she began, her voice barely audible in the sterile room. We were supposed to be in a secure area, but nowhere was really secure, finished Maria, a Navy corpsman who'd served in Iraq. I know exactly what you mean. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Someone who actually understood. The attacks came almost every week, sometimes multiple times in a single day. We'd be operating on wounded soldiers while mortars were landing around us. Dr. Roberts, the group facilitator, leaned forward with interest. That must have been incredibly traumatic. How did you cope with that level of constant stress? I don't think I did cope, Sarah admitted. I just tried to focus on saving lives. But the sounds, the explosions, they never stopped echoing in my head. After the session, Sarah felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. For the first time in months, she'd spoken openly about her experiences without feeling judged. She decided to stop by David's apartment on the way home, thinking maybe she could finally make him understand what she'd been trying to tell him. David was grading papers when she knocked on his door, his living room coffee table covered with red pens and student assignments. Sarah, this is a nice surprise. Come in. She settled onto his couch, still feeling raw from the therapy session but determined to bridge the gap between them. I wanted to tell you about something that happened during my deployment. Something I haven't been able to talk about before. David set down his pen and turned to face her, his expression politely attentive. Okay, I'm listening. Sarah took a deep breath and began to describe the night of March 15th, 2 years ago. How the field hospital had been unusually busy, treating casualties from a firefight that had erupted on the outskirts of the city. How she'd been working on a young soldier, barely 18 years old, who'd taken shrapnel to his abdomen. I was trying to stop the bleeding, she continued, her hands unconsciously mimicking the motions she'd performed that night. But then the first mortar hit. The whole building shook and all the lights went out. We had to continue operating by flashlight while explosions were going off all around us. David listened quietly, but she could see something in his expression that made her stomach clench. Skepticism, polite disbelief. The attacks went on for 3 hours. Sarah pressed on, desperate to make him believe. 3 hours of constant incoming fire. We lost 2 medics that night and 6 patients died because we couldn't get them stable in time. Sarah, David said gently, are you sure you're remembering this correctly? I mean, field hospitals are usually placed well behind the front lines for exactly that reason. They wouldn't put medical facilities in areas where they could be easily targeted. The words hit her like a slap. Are you saying I'm lying? No, of course not. I'm just saying that trauma can sometimes affect how we remember things. Maybe what felt like hours was really just a few minutes. Maybe the explosions weren't as close as they seemed in the moment. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. David, I was there. I lived through it. I know what happened. I believe that you believe that, David said, his voice taking on that infuriating tone people used when they were trying to be understanding while simultaneously dismissing everything you said. But the mind has a way of magnifying traumatic events. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon. So now you're a psychologist? The anger was building in Sarah's chest, hot and fierce. I'm just trying to help you see things objectively. Look, I know you went through something difficult over there, but you have to admit some of your stories seem a bit extreme. Field hospitals getting attacked for hours? Multiple mortar strikes? Come on, Sarah. If that had really happened, it would have been major news. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. This was David, one of her oldest friends, someone who was supposed to care about her. And he was sitting there calmly explaining to her why her own memories couldn't be trusted. You think I'm making this up? She said flatly. I think you're traumatized, and trauma can play tricks on the mind. Maybe what you need is to focus on reality instead of dwelling on these elaborate scenarios. Elaborate scenarios? Sarah's voice was rising now, months of frustration and isolation finally boiling over. You think I've been sitting around making up war stories for attention? I think you've been so focused on justifying your current state that you've convinced yourself your deployment was worse than it actually was. David's tone was becoming more patronizing by the second. Sarah, you were a medic at a field hospital. You weren't in a combat unit. You weren't storming beaches or kicking down doors. You were in a medical facility, treating patients. That's stressful, sure, but it's not the same as being in direct combat. Sarah stood up abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know that you've been using your deployment as an excuse to avoid responsibility for 2 years now, David replied, his patience finally wearing thin. I know that you quit your job, isolated yourself from your friends, and have been living in this bubble of self-pity. At some point, you have to take accountability for your own life. Self-pity? Sarah's voice was barely controlled. You think this is self-pity? I think you've built up this narrative in your head about being a traumatized war hero. And now you're so invested in that story that you can't let it go. David stood up as well, facing her across the coffee table littered with student papers. I've been patient with you, Sarah, we all have. But watching you destroy your life over something that probably wasn't even that bad to begin with. It's getting old. The words hung in the air between them like poison. Sarah felt something inside her break. Some final thread of hope that she could make the people in her life understand what she'd been through. You're right, she said quietly, her voice deadly calm. I should just get over it. After all, what's a little war trauma between friends? That's not what I meant, and you know it. No, I think that's exactly what you meant. Sarah gathered her purse and headed toward the door. Thanks for setting me straight, David. It's good to know where I stand. Sarah, wait. Don't leave like this. But she was already gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through David's apartment like a gunshot. He stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, telling himself he'd done the right thing. Someone had to give her a reality check. Someone had to help her stop living in the past. Outside, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. The voice in her head, the one that sounded increasingly like David's, whispered that maybe he was right. Maybe she was weak. Maybe she was making it all up. But somewhere deep inside, in a part of her that the war hadn't managed to break completely, she knew the truth. She remembered every detail of that night in March, every explosion, every life lost. The scars on her body might be hidden beneath her clothes, but they were real. The shrapnel marks were real. The question was whether anyone would ever believe her enough to see them. 2 years earlier, Sarah had arrived at Forward Operating Base Mercy with high hopes and a sense of purpose that had carried her through months of medical training. The base was located in a region that military briefings described as relatively stable, though she would soon learn that stability was a relative term in a war zone. The field hospital was a collection of reinforced tents and prefabricated buildings surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. It served as the primary medical facility for several smaller outposts scattered throughout the province, treating everything from routine illnesses to combat casualties. Sarah had been assigned to the trauma unit, where her background as a pediatric nurse proved invaluable when treating the young soldiers who seemed to arrive in endless waves. During her first month, Sarah had convinced herself that David and the others back home had been right to worry about her decision to deploy. The work was challenging and emotionally draining, but it wasn't the constant danger she'd imagined. Most days passed without incident, filled with routine medical procedures and the normal rhythm of military life. That changed on March 10th, when intelligence reports began indicating increased insurgent activity in the region. The attack started small, a roadside bomb here, sniper fire there, but they were getting closer to the base with each passing day. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere among the seasoned medical staff. Conversations became more hushed, and everyone seemed to be listening for sounds that hadn't concerned them before. Captain Rodriguez, the trauma unit supervisor, called a staff meeting on March 14th. "I won't sugarcoat this," she said, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim professionalism. "Intelligence suggests this facility may be targeted in the coming days. We're not evacuating. Too many forward units depend on us for medical support, but everyone needs to be prepared for the possibility of treating patients under fire." Sarah had felt her stomach drop at those words, but she'd nodded along with the rest of the staff. She was a soldier now, she told herself. This was what she'd signed up for. The attack began at 11:47 p.m. on March 15th, just as Sarah was finishing her shift in the trauma bay. She'd been working on Staff Sergeant Collins, a 19-year-old from Texas who'd taken shrapnel to his abdomen during a patrol that afternoon. The wounds weren't life-threatening, but they required careful cleaning and suturing to prevent infection. The first mortar landed approximately 50 meters from the main hospital building, close enough to shake the walls and rattle the medical equipment. Sarah's hands had frozen over Collins' wound as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the trauma bay into darkness. "Stay calm." Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the sudden chaos. "Emergency power should kick in any second." But before the backup generators could engage, the second mortar hit closer, much closer. The explosion shattered windows throughout the building and sent Sarah sprawling across the floor, her ears ringing from the blast. In the darkness, she could hear Collins crying out in pain, his wounds having reopened when the gurney tipped over. The emergency lighting finally activated, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the blood on the floor look black. Sarah scrambled to her feet and rushed back to Collins, who was now bleeding heavily from his reopened wounds. Around her, the other medical staff were dealing with similar crises as equipment had been thrown around the room, and several patients had been injured by debris. "We need to get everyone to the bunker," someone shouted, but Captain Rodriguez's voice overrode them. "Negative. We've got critical patients who can't be moved. We continue operations here." What followed were the longest 3 hours of Sarah's life. The mortars kept coming in waves, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes with longer gaps that gave them false hope that the attack was over. Each explosion sent shock waves through the building, causing the walls to flex and dust to rain down from the ceiling. The backup power failed twice, forcing them to work by flashlight and whatever ambient light filtered in from the burning vehicles outside. Sarah lost track of how many patients she treated that night. Some were casualties from the base's defensive positions, who were brought in during brief lulls in the shelling. Others were existing patients whose conditions worsened due to the stress and chaos. She worked with methodical precision, her training taking over even as her hands shook with each nearby explosion. The worst moment came around 2 a.m., when a mortar landed close enough to the trauma bay that the blast wave shattered the remaining windows and sent a shower of concrete fragments throughout the room. Sarah had been leaning over a young soldier from Michigan, trying to establish an IV line in his dehydrated veins, when the explosion threw her sideways into a bank of medical equipment. She remembered the sensation of something hot and sharp tearing through her lower back, just below her left shoulder blade. The pain was immediate and intense, but there wasn't time to address it. The soldier she'd been treating was bleeding from new wounds caused by flying glass, and 3 more casualties had just been brought in from outside. Sarah pressed a field dressing against her own wound and continued working. The adrenaline in her system masked most of the pain, though she could feel warm blood soaking through her uniform. Around her, the other medical staff were dealing with their own injuries while continuing to treat patients. This was what combat medicine really looked like. Not the sterile, controlled environment she'd imagined, but a desperate struggle to save lives while under fire. The attack finally ended just before sunrise, leaving the field hospital looking like a war zone itself. Windows were blown out, equipment was scattered everywhere, and holes in the walls let in the acrid smoke from burning fuel and debris outside. Sarah had collapsed into a chair once the last patient was stabilized, only then becoming fully aware of the pain radiating from her back. Corpsman Martinez had insisted on examining her wound, revealing a jagged piece of concrete that had embedded itself just below her shoulder blade. "You're lucky," he'd said while cleaning the wound. "A few inches to the right and it would have hit your spine." The injury required 12 stitches and left Sarah with a permanent scar that looked like a starburst pattern on her back. But it wasn't the only mark the attack had left on her. 3 more pieces of shrapnel, smaller but still significant, had embedded themselves in her left side during that terrible night. She'd been so focused on treating others that she hadn't even noticed them until hours later. The official after-action report listed the attack as a concentrated mortar barrage lasting approximately 180 minutes, resulting in significant damage to the medical facility and multiple casualties among both patients and staff. Sarah had read those clinical words months later and marveled at how inadequate they seemed to describe what she'd lived through. 2 medics had died that night, Sergeant Williams from Ohio and Corpsman Jackson from California. 6 patients had died due to complications arising from the attack, including Staff Sergeant Collins, whose reopened wounds had led to fatal blood loss. Sarah had held his hand as he died, this teenager from Texas who would never see home again. But when she tried to tell people about that night after returning home, she saw the doubt in their eyes. Field hospitals weren't supposed to be attacked like that. Medical personnel weren't supposed to be in direct danger. The reality of her experience didn't match their preconceptions about how the war was conducted. Even the Veterans Affairs doctor who'd examined her upon her return had seemed skeptical when she described the attack. Multiple shrapnel wounds from a mortar attack on a field hospital, he'd asked, reviewing her medical records. "That's quite unusual. Are you sure these weren't from a vehicle accident or some other incident?" Sarah had wanted to scream at him, to show him the scars that crisscrossed her back and side like a map of that terrible night. Instead, she'd quietly confirmed the details of her story and accepted his recommendation for counseling to address what he termed possible trauma-related memory distortion. That phrase had haunted her ever since. Memory distortion, as if the scars on her body were somehow less real than the doubt in everyone else's minds. As if the names of the dead were something she'd imagined rather than carved into her heart with the same permanence as the shrapnel marks on her skin. Sitting in her apartment now, 2 years later, Sarah traced the largest scar with her finger through the fabric of her shirt. The raised tissue was still tender to the touch, still a daily reminder of what she'd survived. But David and the others would never see these marks, would never understand their significance, because acknowledging them would mean accepting that their comfortable assumptions about the war were wrong. It was easier for them to believe she was exaggerating, easier to think she was weak or seeking attention, than to confront the reality that a small-town teacher from Ohio had experienced, something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of what modern warfare looked like. The truth was written on her body in scars and shrapnel marks, but truth, Sarah was learning, was often the thing people were least willing to see. 3 weeks after her confrontation with David, Sarah found herself sitting across from her sister Jennifer in the familiar kitchen of her childhood home. The yellow wallpaper with tiny daisies that their mother had hung 20 years ago still covered the walls, and the same ceramic rooster collection lined the windowsill above the sink. Everything looked exactly as it had before Sarah's deployment, as if time had stood still while her world had been turned upside down. Jennifer was folding laundry with the efficient movements of someone who had 3 children under the age of 10. Her hands never stopped moving as she spoke, creating neat piles of tiny shirts and pants on the kitchen table. "Mom's worried about you," she said without looking up. "We all are." Sarah sipped her coffee and watched her sister work. Jennifer had always been the practical one, the sister who'd followed the expected path of marriage, children, and suburban life. She meant well, but Sarah could already sense the direction this conversation was heading. "David called me," Jennifer continued, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. "He said you stormed out of his apartment after he tried to talk some sense into you." "Tried to talk sense into me?" Sarah set down her coffee cup harder than she'd intended. "Is that what he called it?" He's concerned about you, Sarah. We all are. You've been living like a hermit for 2 years. You quit your job. You barely talk to anyone anymore. Jennifer picked up a small pink dress and shook it out before folding it. And these stories you tell about what happened over there, they just don't add up. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. What do you mean they don't add up? I looked it up online, Jennifer said, her voice taking on that careful tone people used when they thought they were being helpful. Field hospitals are placed in secure areas well behind the front lines. They're not supposed to be attacked. And you said there were multiple mortar strikes over several hours. Sarah, that would have been major international news if it really happened. Just because it wasn't on CNN doesn't mean it didn't happen, Sarah replied, but she could hear the defensiveness in her own voice. Jennifer set down the shirt she'd been folding and looked directly at her sister. I called the VA hospital and spoke to someone in the records department. They said there's no documentation of any field hospital being subjected to a sustained mortar attack during the time you were deployed. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her own sister had been investigating her story, checking up on her like she was a child caught in a lie. You called the VA? You actually called them to verify whether I was telling the truth? I was trying to help, Jennifer said defensively. I thought maybe if we could get some clarity about what really happened, we could help you deal with it appropriately. Deal with it appropriately, Sarah repeated slowly. And what would be the appropriate way to deal with it, Jennifer? Maybe some counseling to help you separate reality from whatever traumatic memories you think you have. Maybe some medication to help with the anxiety and depression. But you can't keep living in this fantasy where you're some kind of war hero who survived impossible odds. Sarah stared at her sister in disbelief. Fantasy? You think this is a fantasy? I think you had a difficult deployment and you're processing it in an unhealthy way. Look, I know being away from home for a year was hard. I know you saw some injured soldiers and that was traumatic. But Sarah, you were a medic at a field hospital. You weren't in combat. You weren't under fire. You need to stop acting like you survived some kind of major battle. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jennifer becoming increasingly frustrated with what she saw as Sarah's stubborn refusal to accept reality. She'd done her research, she explained. She'd talked to other military families. She'd consulted with her husband, who'd served briefly in the National Guard. The consensus was clear. Sarah's version of events simply wasn't possible. By the time Sarah left her sister's house, she felt completely hollow inside. First David, now Jennifer. The two people who'd been closest to her before her deployment had both concluded that she was either lying or delusional. The worst part was the certainty in their voices, the absolute conviction that they understood her experience better than she did. That evening, Sarah drove to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, hoping to find someone who might understand. The building was a converted house on the outskirts of town, with American flags lining the front walkway and a sign advertising weekly bingo nights. Inside, a handful of older men sat around a bar watching a baseball game, their conversation punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Sarah approached the bartender, a man in his 60s with navy tattoos covering his forearms. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I'm looking for information about support groups for recent veterans." The bartender studied her for a moment, taking in her slight frame and nervous demeanor. "You serve overseas, honey?" "Afghanistan. I was a medic with the reserves." One of the men at the bar turned around, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Well, I'll be damned. We don't get many lady vets in here. Welcome home, sweetheart." Sarah felt a moment of hope. Finally, people who might understand. But as she began to describe her experiences to the small group that gathered around her, she saw the same skeptical expression she'd encountered everywhere else. "Field hospital under attack for 3 hours?" asked a Vietnam veteran named Frank. "That doesn't sound right. Medical facilities have special protections under the Geneva Convention. Nobody targets hospitals." "Maybe it was some kind of training exercise," suggested another man. "Sometimes they run realistic drills to prepare medical staff for emergency situations. Or maybe you were closer to a forward operating base than you realized," added Frank. "Sometimes the sound of distant artillery can seem closer than it really is, especially at night." Sarah tried to explain the details, the shattered windows, the injuries to medical staff, the patients who died during the attack, but she could see the doubt in their eyes, the same polite disbelief she'd encountered everywhere else. These were men who'd served in actual combat zones, who'd seen real warfare. To them, her story sounded like the exaggerated memories of someone who'd never experienced true danger. The final blow came when Frank gently suggested that she might benefit from talking to someone about embellishment syndrome, a condition where people who'd experienced minor trauma convince themselves they'd been through something more significant. Sarah left the VFW post feeling more isolated than ever. If even other veterans didn't believe her, who would? She drove home through the quiet suburban streets of her hometown, past the houses where normal people lived normal lives, untouched by the kind of violence she'd witnessed. Back in her apartment, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and slowly lifted her shirt. The scars were still there, of course. The large starburst pattern below her left shoulder blade, the smaller marks along her ribs where shrapnel had peppered her side. She traced each one with her finger, remembering the moment it had been created, the pain and chaos of that night in March. But nobody wanted to see these scars. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what they represented. It was easier to believe that she was mentally unstable, that she was seeking attention or sympathy, than to accept that a field hospital could be attacked the way hers had been. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from David. "I heard you talk to Jennifer today. I hope you're starting to see that we're all just trying to help you. It's time to let go of this narrative and move forward with your life." She stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. Narrative, as if her memories were something she'd constructed rather than lived through, as if the scars on her body were props in some elaborate performance rather than permanent reminders of the worst night of her life. Outside her apartment window, the world continued its normal rhythm. Cars drove by carrying people to dinner plans and evening activities. Porch lights came on as families settled in for another peaceful night in suburban Ohio. None of them knew that Sarah Henderson, the elementary school teacher who lived in apartment 3B, had once spent 3 hours treating wounded soldiers while mortar rounds exploded around her. And increasingly, it seemed like none of them wanted to know. The truth was too uncomfortable, too far removed from their understanding of how wars were supposed to work. It was easier to believe that she was the problem, that she was weak or lying, or mentally unstable, than to confront the possibility that their assumptions about military service were fundamentally flawed. Sarah touched the largest scar through her shirt one more time, then turned away from the mirror. Tomorrow she would try again to make someone understand. Tomorrow she would find someone who believed her. But tonight she was tired of fighting a war that everyone insisted had never happened. 6 months had passed since Sarah's confrontation with David, and the isolation had become a living thing that wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She'd stopped trying to explain her experiences to anyone, stopped attending the veterans support group, stopped answering calls from family members who wanted to check in on her progress. The silence in her small apartment had become both her sanctuary and her prison. Dr. Martinez had been patient with her during their weekly sessions, but even he seemed to be losing faith in her version of events. "Sarah," he said during one particularly difficult appointment, "I've been thinking about our conversations, and I'm wondering if we need to consider the possibility that your memories of the deployment might be affected by post-traumatic stress." Sarah had stared at him from across his office, noting the careful way he'd phrased his doubt. "You don't believe me either." "I believe that you believe what you're telling me," Dr. Martinez replied, echoing the same maddening phrase she'd heard from everyone else. "But trauma can alter our perception of events. Sometimes our minds create more dramatic narratives to help us process difficult experiences." The appointment had ended with Dr. Martinez suggesting they explore cognitive processing therapy to help her develop a more realistic understanding of her deployment. Sarah had nodded politely and scheduled another appointment, but she knew she wouldn't be coming back. There was no point in continuing to pay someone to explain to her why her own memories couldn't be trusted. The worst part was that she was starting to doubt herself. Late at night, when the shadows in her apartment took on threatening shapes and every sound made her heart race, Sarah would find herself questioning what had really happened in Afghanistan. Maybe David was right. Maybe she was weak, unable to handle even the relatively minor stress of working in a field hospital. Maybe she had constructed this elaborate story to justify her current state of mind. But then she would catch sight of herself in the bathroom mirror while getting ready for bed, and the scars would remind her of the truth. The physical evidence was undeniable, even if no one was willing to look at it. The raised tissue on her back told the story of that night in March better than any words ever could. Sarah had begun to avoid mirrors altogether, unable to bear the contradiction between what she knew to be true and what everyone else insisted was impossible. She wore long sleeves even in the summer heat, not just to hide the scars but to hide from them herself. If she couldn't see the evidence, maybe she could pretend it didn't exist. Maybe she could join everyone else in believing that she was simply unstable. Her financial situation was becoming desperate. The disability payments from the VA barely covered her rent and basic expenses, and she hadn't worked since returning from deployment. She'd applied for teaching positions at several local schools, but the interviews had gone poorly. Her former colleagues had heard about her problems, and word traveled fast in a small town. No one wanted to hire someone who might have a mental breakdown in front of a classroom full of children. David had taken it upon himself to stage what he called an intervention at her apartment one evening in late October. He'd brought Jennifer and their mother, along with Pastor Williams from the church Sarah had attended as a child. They'd arranged themselves in her small living room like a tribunal, their faces wearing expressions of concerned determination. "Sarah, we love you," her mother had begun, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "But we can't stand by and watch you destroy your life with these delusions." "They're not delusions," Sarah had replied automatically, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Pastor Williams had leaned forward in his chair, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes the mind creates stories to help us cope with pain, Sarah. There's no shame in that. But God wants us to live in truth, not in fantasies that keep us trapped in the past." The conversation had continued for over an hour, with each person taking turns to express their love for her, while simultaneously explaining why nothing she remembered could possibly be true. They'd done their research, they said. They'd consulted with military experts and medical professionals. The consensus was unanimous. Field hospitals were not targeted in the way Sarah described. "The important thing now is to get you the help you need," David had said, producing a brochure for an inpatient psychiatric facility in Cleveland. "Dr. Patterson specializes in trauma-related disorders. He can help you work through these false memories and develop coping strategies for dealing with reality." Sarah had looked around the room at the faces of people who claimed to love her, people who had known her since childhood, people who should have trusted her enough to at least consider that she might be telling the truth. Instead, they were sitting in her living room planning her institutionalization because her memories didn't conform to their expectations. "Get out," she'd said quietly. "Sarah, please don't be unreasonable," Jennifer had pleaded. "We're trying to help you." "Get out of my apartment," Sarah had repeated, her voice growing stronger. "All of you. Right now." They'd left reluctantly, with promises to return and threats to contact Adult Protective Services if she didn't seek treatment voluntarily. Sarah had locked the door behind them and spent the rest of the night curled up on her couch, wondering if they might be right. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe the scars were from something else entirely. Maybe she'd convinced herself that they were from shrapnel when they were really from a car accident or a fall or some other mundane incident. The doubts crept in like poison, contaminating her memories until she couldn't trust her own mind. She began to avoid sleeping, afraid of the dreams that would remind her of that night in March. When exhaustion finally forced her into unconsciousness, she would wake up screaming, her shirt soaked with sweat and her hands instinctively reaching for wounds that everyone insisted had never existed. One particularly bad night, Sarah had stood in her bathroom with a pair of scissors, staring at her reflection in the mirror. If the scars were the problem, if they were the things that kept reminding her of memories that couldn't be trusted, maybe she should get rid of them. The logic seemed sound in her sleep-deprived state. No scars meant no evidence, and no evidence meant she could finally accept everyone else's version of reality. She'd actually pressed the point of the scissors against the largest scar before the absurdity of what she was doing hit her. She wasn't crazy. The scars were real, the memories were real, and the fact that no one believed her didn't change the truth of what she'd experienced. But knowing the truth and living with it were two different things. Sarah found herself trapped between the reality of her memories and the reality of her social isolation. She could choose to believe herself and remain alone, or she could accept everyone else's version of events and rejoin the world. The choice seemed impossible, but it was becoming clear that she couldn't continue living in this liminal space between truth and doubt. Something had to give. Either she would find a way to prove what had happened to her, or she would have to accept that her own mind was the enemy she'd been fighting all along. As winter approached and the walls of her apartment seemed to close in around her, Sarah made a decision. She would make one final attempt to make someone believe her. If that failed, she would check herself into the psychiatric facility David had recommended and let the doctors explain to her why her memories were wrong. But first, she needed to find the right person. Someone who would be willing to look at the evidence she carried on her body, someone who wouldn't dismiss her story before examining the proof. The scars were still there, after all. Whatever else might be uncertain, whatever else might be distorted by trauma or time, the physical evidence remained. The shrapnel marks were real, even if everyone insisted the story behind them was not. Sarah just needed to find someone willing to see them. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital was the last place Sarah had wanted to end up, but the chest pains that had started that morning had become too severe to ignore. She'd tried to convince herself it was just another panic attack, but when her left arm began to tingle and she could barely catch her breath, she'd finally called an ambulance. Now she lay on a gurney in a curtained-off section of the ER, electrodes attached to her chest and an IV line running into her arm. The attending physician, Dr. Rebecca Chen, was reviewing her chart with a furrowed brow, clearly trying to piece together Sarah's medical history. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said, approaching the bed with a gentle smile. "The good news is that your EKG looks normal, and your blood work doesn't show any signs of a heart attack. However, I'm seeing some concerning indicators of severe anxiety and possible panic disorder. Can you tell me about any recent stressors in your life?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. Where would she even begin? "It's been a difficult few years," she said simply. Dr. Chen nodded and made a note in her chart. "I see here that you're a veteran. Sometimes military service can contribute to anxiety disorders. Have you been receiving any treatment through the VA system?" "I was, but I stopped going to appointments a few months ago." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the gurney, very aware that she was wearing only a hospital gown that tied in the back. "I'm going to need to examine you for any physical signs of distress that might be contributing to your symptoms," Dr. Chen said, moving to the head of the bed. "I'll need you to sit up and lean forward so I can listen to your lungs." Sarah complied, feeling the cool metal of the stethoscope against her back as Dr. Chen moved it to different positions. But instead of the routine examination she'd expected, the doctor suddenly stopped moving entirely. Sarah could sense her standing perfectly still behind her, and the silence stretched on for several uncomfortable seconds. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said finally, her voice careful and professional but tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Can you tell me about these scars on your back?" Sarah's heart began to race again, but for an entirely different reason than the panic attack that had brought her here. Someone was actually looking at the scars. Someone was seeing the evidence with their own eyes. "They're from shrapnel," Sarah said quietly. "From my deployment in Afghanistan." She heard Dr. Chen take a sharp breath. "These are extensive. The largest one appears to be from a significant piece of debris or projectile, and there are multiple smaller wounds along your left side. When did these occur?" "March 15th, 2 years ago, during a mortar attack on the field hospital where I was stationed." Dr. Chen moved around to face Sarah, her expression now completely focused and alert. "Ms. Henderson, I need to ask you some specific questions about these injuries. Were they treated in theater, or did you receive medical attention for them after returning home?" "They were treated at the field hospital after the attack ended. Corpsman Martinez stitched up the largest one and they removed the smaller pieces of shrapnel over the following days." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying Sarah's face intently. "Ms. Henderson, I served as a trauma surgeon with the Army Medical Corps for 6 years. I did 3 deployments in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I've treated hundreds of combat casualties, and I know what shrapnel wounds look like." Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to loosen, as if a knot that had been tied for 2 years was finally starting to come undone. "These are definitely shrapnel wounds," Dr. Chen continued. "The pattern and scarring are consistent with high-velocity fragments from an explosive device. The largest wound shows characteristics of concrete or masonry debris, which would be consistent with structural damage from a mortar round. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face, but for the first time in months they weren't tears of frustration or despair. Someone finally saw. Someone finally understood. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to tell people about the attack for 2 years. My family, my friends, even other veterans, they all think I'm lying or mentally unstable. They say field hospitals don't get attacked like that." Dr. Chen's expression darkened. "Ms. Henderson, field hospitals absolutely can be targeted despite supposed protections under international law. I've personally treated casualties from 3 separate attacks on medical facilities during my deployments. The insurgents didn't much care about Geneva Convention protocols." She pulled up a chair and sat down beside Sarah's bed, her demeanor shifting from clinical professional to fellow veteran. "Can you tell me about the specific attack?" "I'm familiar with most of the major incidents involving medical facilities during that time period." Sarah found herself describing that night in March with more detail than she'd shared with anyone since returning home. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her familiarity with military medical operations. When Sarah described the duration of the attack and the casualties they'd sustained, Dr. Chen's face grew grim. "Forward Operating Base Mercy," Dr. Chen said when Sarah finished. "I remember reading about that attack in the classified briefings. It was considered a significant intelligence failure because the insurgents had somehow obtained detailed information about the facility's layout and defensive positions." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "You know about it? You actually know about the attack?" "Ms. Henderson, that incident was extensively documented and studied by military leadership. It led to major changes in how medical facilities are protected and positioned. The fact that anyone has been telling you it didn't happen is—" Dr. Chen paused, clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure. "That's unconscionable. But why isn't it public knowledge? Why can't people find information about it online?" Dr. Chen sighed heavily. "Because admitting that a field hospital was successfully targeted for 3 hours would have been a public relations nightmare. It would have undermined confidence in the military's ability to protect its own medical personnel. The incident was classified, and the families of the casualties were given alternative explanations for how their loved ones died." The full weight of what Dr. Chen was saying hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only had the attack really happened, but there had been a deliberate effort to cover it up, to deny its existence. No wonder she couldn't find any record of it online. No wonder the VA had no documentation of it in their files. "Dr. Chen," Sarah said, "can you help me? Can you document what you found? Because I'm starting to think my family wants to have me committed to a psychiatric facility." Dr. Chen's face hardened with anger. "Ms. Henderson, what's been done to you is a form of gaslighting that borders on psychological abuse. You've been systematically told that your own memories can't be trusted, despite carrying physical evidence of your trauma on your body." She stood up and moved to a computer terminal in the corner of the examination area. "I'm going to document these injuries in your medical record, along with my professional assessment of their origin. I'm also going to provide you with a written statement describing what I've observed and confirming that your injuries are consistent with your account of the events." As Dr. Chen typed, Sarah felt as if she was emerging from a fog that had surrounded her for 2 years. The validation was overwhelming, but it also brought with it a new kind of anger. How many people had looked at her with pity and condescension, convinced that she was either lying or delusional? How many opportunities for healing had been lost because everyone around her had been more invested in maintaining their own comfortable assumptions than in listening to her truth? "Doctor," Sarah said, "what should I do about my family? About all the people who've been telling me I'm crazy?" Dr. Chen finished typing and turned back to face her. "That's ultimately your decision, Ms. Henderson. But I will say this. Anyone who refuses to acknowledge physical evidence in favor of their own preconceptions is not acting in your best interests, regardless of their intentions." She printed out several pages and handed them to Sarah. "This is a complete medical assessment of your injuries, along with my professional opinion about their origin. It also includes information about the classified nature of the incident you survived. If anyone continues to doubt your account after reviewing this documentation, then their skepticism isn't based on evidence. It's based on their unwillingness to accept an uncomfortable truth. Sarah looked down at the papers in her hands. Official medical documentation that validated everything she'd been trying to tell people for 2 years. The relief was indescribable, but it was tinged with sadness for all the time she'd lost doubting herself. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said gently, "I want you to know that what you survived that night was extraordinary. The fact that you continued treating patients while under direct fire, despite being wounded yourself, represents the very best of military medical service. You should be proud of what you did, not ashamed of how it's affected you since." For the first time in 2 years, Sarah allowed herself to feel that pride. She had served with honor under impossible circumstances. She had saved lives while risking her own. The scars on her body weren't marks of weakness or delusion. They were evidence of courage and sacrifice. Now she just had to decide what to do with the truth she'd finally been given permission to believe. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital was the last place Sarah had wanted to end up. But the chest pains that had started that morning had become too severe to ignore. She tried to convince herself it was just another panic attack. But when her left arm began to tingle and she could barely catch her breath, she'd finally called an ambulance. Now she lay on a gurney in a curtained-off section of the ER. Electrodes attached to her chest and an IV line running into her arm. The attending physician, Dr. Rebecca Chen, was reviewing her chart with a furrowed brow, clearly trying to piece together Sarah's medical history. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said, approaching the bed with a gentle smile, "the good news is that your EKG looks normal and your blood work doesn't show any signs of a heart attack. However, I'm seeing some concerning indicators of severe anxiety and possible panic disorder. Can you tell me about any recent stressors in your life?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. Where would she even begin? "It's been a difficult few years," she said simply. Dr. Chen nodded and made a note in her chart. "I see here that you're a veteran. Sometimes military service can contribute to anxiety disorders. Have you been receiving any treatment through the VA system?" "I was, but I stopped going to appointments a few months ago." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the gurney, very aware that she was wearing only a hospital gown that tied in the back. "I'm going to need to examine you for any physical signs of distress that might be contributing to your symptoms," Dr. Chen said, moving to the head of the bed. "I'll need you to sit up and lean forward so I can listen to your lungs." Sarah complied, feeling the cool metal of the stethoscope against her back as Dr. Chen moved it to different positions. But instead of the routine examination she'd expected, the doctor suddenly stopped moving entirely. Sarah could sense her standing perfectly still behind her, and the silence stretched on for several uncomfortable seconds. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said finally, her voice careful and professional but tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Can you tell me about these scars on your back?" Sarah's heart began to race again, but for an entirely different reason than the panic attack that had brought her here. Someone was actually looking at the scars. Someone was seeing the evidence with their own eyes. "They're from shrapnel," Sarah said quietly. "From my deployment in Afghanistan." She heard Dr. Chen take a sharp breath. "These are extensive. The largest one appears to be from a significant piece of debris or projectile, and there are multiple smaller wounds along your left side." "When did these occur?" "March 15th, 2 years ago, during a mortar attack on the field hospital where I was stationed." Dr. Chen moved around to face Sarah, her expression now completely focused and alert. "Ms. Henderson, I need to ask you some specific questions about these injuries. Were they treated in theater, or did you receive medical attention for them after returning home?" "They were treated at the field hospital after the attack ended. Corpsman Martinez stitched up the largest one, and they removed the smaller pieces of shrapnel over the following days." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying Sarah's face intently. "Ms. Henderson, I served as a trauma surgeon with the Army Medical Corps for 6 years. I did 3 deployments in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I've treated hundreds of combat casualties, and I know what shrapnel wounds look like." Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to loosen, as if a knot that had been tied for 2 years was finally starting to come undone. "These are definitely shrapnel wounds," Dr. Chen continued. The pattern and scarring are consistent with high-velocity fragments from an explosive device. The largest wound shows characteristics of concrete or masonry debris, which would be consistent with structural damage from a mortar round. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of frustration or despair. Someone finally saw. Someone finally understood. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to tell people about the attack for 2 years. My family, my friends, even other veterans. They all think I'm lying or mentally unstable. They say field hospitals don't get attacked like that." Dr. Chen's expression darkened. "Ms. Henderson, field hospitals absolutely can be targeted, despite supposed protections under international law. I've personally treated casualties from 3 separate attacks on medical facilities during my deployments. The insurgents didn't much care about Geneva Convention protocols." She pulled up a chair and sat down beside Sarah's bed, her demeanor shifting from clinical professional to fellow veteran. "Can you tell me about the specific attack? I'm familiar with most of the major incidents involving medical facilities during that time period." Sarah found herself describing that night in March with more detail than she'd shared with anyone since returning home. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her familiarity with military medical operations. When Sarah described the duration of the attack and the casualties they'd sustained, Dr. Chen's face grew grim. "Forward Operating Base Mercy," Dr. Chen said when Sarah finished. "I remember reading about that attack in the classified briefings. It was considered a significant intelligence failure because the insurgents had somehow obtained detailed information about the facility's layout and defensive positions." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "You know about it? You actually know about the attack?" "Ms. Henderson, that incident was extensively documented and studied by military leadership. It led to major changes in how medical facilities are protected and positioned. The fact that anyone has been telling you it didn't happen is—" Dr. Chen paused, clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure. "That's unconscionable. But why isn't it public knowledge? Why can't people find information about it online?" Dr. Chen sighed heavily. "Because admitting that a field hospital was successfully targeted for 3 hours would have been a public relations nightmare. It would have undermined confidence in the military's ability to protect its own medical personnel. The incident was classified, and the families of the casualties were given alternative explanations for how their loved ones died." The full weight of what Dr. Chen was saying hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only had the attack really happened, but there had been a deliberate effort to cover it up, to deny its existence. No wonder she couldn't find any record of it online. No wonder the VA had no documentation of it in their files. "Dr. Chen," Sarah said, "can you help me? Can you document what you've found? Because I'm starting to think my family wants to have me committed to a psychiatric facility." Dr. Chen's face hardened with anger. "Ms. Henderson, what's been done to you is a form of gaslighting that borders on psychological abuse. You've been systematically told that your own memories can't be trusted, despite carrying physical evidence of your trauma on your body." She stood up and moved to a computer terminal in the corner of the examination area. "I'm going to document these injuries in your medical record, along with my professional assessment of their origin. I'm also going to provide you with a written statement describing what I've observed and confirming that your injuries are consistent with your account of the events." As Dr. Chen typed, Sarah felt as if she was emerging from a fog that had surrounded her for 2 years. The validation was overwhelming, but it also brought with it a new kind of anger. How many people had looked at her with pity and condescension, convinced that she was either lying or delusional? How many opportunities for healing had been lost, because everyone around her had been more invested in maintaining their own comfortable assumptions than in listening to her truth? "Doctor," Sarah said, "what should I do about my family? About all the people who've been telling me I'm crazy?" "Doctor," Chen finished typing and turned back to face her. "That's ultimately your decision, Ms. Henderson. But I will say this. Anyone who refuses to acknowledge physical evidence in favor of their own preconceptions is not acting in your best interests, regardless of their intentions." She printed out several pages and handed them to Sarah. This is a complete medical assessment of your injuries, along with my professional opinion about their origin. It also includes information about the classified nature of the incident you survived. If anyone continues to doubt your account after reviewing this documentation, then their skepticism isn't based on evidence. It's based on their unwillingness to accept an uncomfortable truth. Sarah looked down at the papers in her hands. Official, medical documentation that validated everything she'd been trying to tell people for 2 years. The relief was indescribable, but it was tinged with sadness for all the time she'd lost doubting herself. "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Chen said gently, "I want you to know that what you survived that night was extraordinary. The fact that you continued, treating patients while under direct fire, despite being wounded yourself, represents the very best of military medical service. You should be proud of what you did, not ashamed of how it's affected you since." For the first time in 2 years, Sarah allowed herself to feel that pride. She'd served with honor under impossible circumstances. She had saved lives while risking her own. The scars on her body weren't marks of weakness or delusion. They were evidence of courage and sacrifice. Now she just had to decide what to do with the truth she'd finally been given permission to believe. Sarah sat in her car outside David's apartment building for nearly an hour. Dr. Chen's medical documentation folded carefully in her purse. 3 days had passed since her emergency room visit, 3 days of reading and rereading the official validation of her experiences. The paper had become her lifeline, concrete proof that she wasn't crazy, wasn't weak, wasn't lying. She'd spent those 3 days thinking about what she wanted to say to the people who had dismissed her truth so casually. The anger was still there, burning quietly in her chest, but it was tempered now by a kind of sadness for all the time that had been lost, all the healing that had been delayed by their refusal to believe her. Finally, Sarah gathered her courage and walked up to David's apartment. He answered the door in sweatpants and a college t-shirt, his hair messy like he'd just woken up from a nap. His expression immediately shifted to one of wary concern when he saw her standing there. "Sarah, this is unexpected. Are you okay?" "I need to show you something," she said, stepping past him into the familiar living room where they'd had their confrontation months before. "Something that might change your perspective about my deployment." David closed the door and followed her, his posture tense. "Sarah, if this is about those stories again, I really think you should be talking to a professional, not—" "David," Sarah interrupted, turning to face him with a calmness that surprised even her. "I need you to stop talking and listen to me. Really listen this time." Something in her tone must have gotten through to him, because he fell silent and took a seat on his couch. Sarah remained standing, drawing strength from the medical documents in her purse. 3 days ago, I was taken to the emergency room with chest pains, she began. The attending physician was Dr. Rebecca Chen, a trauma surgeon who served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. During her examination, she discovered the scars on my back. David opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. Dr. Chen immediately recognized them as shrapnel wounds. She said the pattern and scarring were consistent with high-velocity fragments from an explosive device, specifically concrete or masonry debris from a mortar round. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out the medical documentation. She also said she remembered reading about the attack on Forward Operating Base Mercy in classified military briefings. She handed the papers to David, watching his face as he began to read. His expression changed gradually from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been horror as he absorbed the clinical description of her injuries and Dr. Chen's professional assessment. "The Kai attack was classified," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "The military didn't want the public to know that a field hospital had been successfully targeted for 3 hours. It would have been a public relations disaster. So they covered it up, and the families of the people who died were given alternative explanations." David looked up from the papers, his face pale. "Sarah, I don't understand. If this really happened, why didn't you show these scars to someone before? Why didn't you prove—" "Because I shouldn't have had to prove anything," Sarah said, her calm finally cracking slightly. "Because when someone you've known for 15 years tells you they were injured in a war, the appropriate response isn't to demand physical evidence. It's to believe them and offer support." The silence stretched between them as David continued reading through the documentation, Sarah could see him struggling to reconcile what he was learning with the assumptions he'd held for the past 2 years. "Jesus, Sarah," he said finally, setting the papers down on his coffee table. "Some of these injuries. The doctor says this one could have killed you if it had been a few inches to the right." "I know," Sarah replied simply. "I was there." David looked up at her, and for the first time since her return from deployment, she saw genuine understanding in his eyes. But she also saw something else: shame, guilt, the dawning realization of what his disbelief had cost her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping you. I thought I was being a good friend by encouraging you to face reality. But you never considered that maybe I was the one living in reality, and you were the one who needed to face some uncomfortable truths about what military service actually looks like." David put his head in his hands, and Sarah could see his shoulders shaking slightly. "I made you doubt yourself. I made you think you were crazy. I can't believe How can you even stand to be in the same room with me?" Sarah looked down at him. This man who had been one of her closest friends and felt the anger she'd been carrying for months finally beginning to dissolve. He'd been wrong, terribly and destructively wrong, but she could see that he genuinely hadn't understood the harm he was causing. "Because I know you thought you were helping," she said, sitting down across from him. "Because I know you care about me, even if you went about showing it in the worst possible way." They talked for another 2 hours, with David asking careful questions about her experiences and Sarah finally being able to share her story with someone who was truly listening. He apologized repeatedly, his guilt and shame palpable as he began to understand how his skepticism had compounded her trauma. "What can I do?" he asked as Sarah prepared to leave. "How can I help you now?" "How can I make this right?" "You can start by believing other veterans when they tell you about their experiences," Sarah said. "You can remember that your assumptions about how war works might be wrong. And you can help me talk to my family, because they're going to need to see this documentation too." The conversation with Jennifer and their parents went much the same way, though it was more emotionally charged. Her mother cried when she read Dr. Chen's assessment, overwhelmed by guilt for the intervention she'd organized. Jennifer was angry at first, defensive about her own role in dismissing Sarah's story. But eventually she too broke down and apologized. "I thought I was protecting you," Jennifer said through her tears. "I thought if I could convince you that it wasn't as bad as you remembered, maybe you could heal faster." "But healing isn't about forgetting," Sarah replied. "It's about processing what really happened and learning to live with it. You can't heal from something if everyone around you insists it never existed." The family meeting that followed was painful but necessary. Sarah's parents, David and Jennifer, all acknowledged their role in gaslighting her, in making her doubt her own memories and experiences. They committed to supporting her actual healing process rather than their preferred version of it. But perhaps the most important conversation Sarah had was with herself, standing in front of her bathroom mirror a week later. For the first time in 2 years, she looked directly at the scars on her back without shame or doubt. These marks told the story of her courage, her service, her survival. They were proof of a night when she had continued to save lives despite being under fire. Despite being wounded herself, Dr. Chen had referred her to a new therapist, Dr. Amanda Walsh, who specialized in treating veterans whose trauma had been compounded by lack of social support. Their first session had been revelatory. "What you've experienced is called institutional betrayal," Dr. Walsh had explained. "It occurs when the very systems that are supposed to support trauma survivors instead deny or minimize their experiences. It can be even more damaging than the original trauma, because it attacks the survivor's sense of reality." Sarah had also connected with other veterans through Dr. Chen, people who had experienced similar cover-ups and denials of their service-related injuries. She learned that her experience, while extreme, wasn't unique. There were others who had been gaslit by institutions, families, and communities that weren't ready to confront the reality of modern warfare. 3 months after her emergency room visit, Sarah returned to teaching. The principal who hired her at Lincoln Elementary had read Dr. Chen's documentation and understood that Sarah's struggles weren't signs of instability, but evidence of someone who had survived extraordinary circumstances and was working to heal from them. On her first day back in the classroom, standing in front of a group of bright-faced third graders, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer felt like sources of shame. They were reminders of her strength, her service, her refusal to give up even when everyone around her insisted her truth wasn't real. That evening, David called to check on how her first day had gone. Their friendship was slowly rebuilding, though it would never be quite the same as before. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken and painfully rebuilt. "I keep thinking about all the time we wasted," he said during their conversation.
"All the healing you could have been doing if we had just listened to you from the beginning." "The time wasn't wasted," Sarah replied.
Looking out her apartment window at the familiar streets of her hometown, I learned something important about myself during those 2 years. I learned that I'm strong enough to hold on to the truth even